Good afternoon, I'm Brent, Holland, and welcome to today's show. This afternoon, the Right Honorable Irwin Cotler. Just let me tell you what this man has accomplished. He has defended political prisoners in Peru, Tunisia, China, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Russia. He has addressed major academic gatherings in Washington, Moscow, and Jerusalem. He has argued before the Supreme Courts of both Canada and Israel, and he has testified before parliamentary committees in Canada, the U.S., Norway, Russia, and various Latin American states. The Right Honorable Irwin Cotler, of course, was Canada's Attorney General up until the change of government in the last election, and he now has something else to add to his resume. He is indeed a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for 2010. Canada's own. Let me say that again because it has a wonderful ring to it. Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Mr. Cotler also worked diligently during the apartheid regime in South Africa to free none other than Nelson Mandela. Folks, if you're just joining us today, we're speaking with the Right Honorable Irwin Cotler. If that name is familiar to you, it certainly should be. Mr. Cotler, of course, was Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General from 2003 till 2006. Now, just listen to this for a little bit as a resume. He's a professor of law at McGill University, director of its Human Rights Program, Member of Parliament, of course, for Mount Royal in Montreal. Harvard Law School Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Law. He is past president of the Canadian Jewish Congress. He's on the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Human Rights, International Development, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Criminal Court, and he's a special advisor for them. Sir, this begs a serious question. How does your wife put up with you?
Well, the good thing is that she's a very politically engaged person on her own. So you could, have a CV with respect to her that will show you a no less compelling set of involvements. And very often it's with regard to the same causes, though not always on the same exact side in those causes.
That's quite an outstanding achievement, sir. Congratulations for both of you. Folks, we're going to dive in right now. As you know...
well, she ran my campaign, so that gives you a sense of why I've had so much success.
There you go. That's a very, very good response. One I'm sure will earn you substantial brownie points at home, my friend.
I can use it.
Oh, tell me about that one. Let's jump in and talk right away. As I'm taping this, folks, the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, was just in New York at the United Nations, and of course everything was the Zionist regime, and the evil West. And let's talk about your petition, sir, and what led to it.
Well, we have a petition which is titled The Danger of a Nuclear Genocidal Inciting Rights-Violating Iran, the Responsibility to Prevent. What led to it was really the emergence of Ahmadinejad's Iran, and I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics of Iran, who are otherwise the objects of massive domestic repression. The emergence of Ahmadinejad's Iran as a threat and a clear and present danger to international peace and security, to Middle East and regional stability, to Israel and the Jewish people, and increasingly to his own people. Because what you have in Iran today is the toxic convergence of four distinct yet interrelated threats. The nuclear threat, the threat of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the threat of state sponsorship of international terrorism, and, as I mentioned, domestic mass repression. There should be no mistake about these in each of these instances. Ahmadinejad and Ahmadinejad's Iran is in standing violation of international law prohibitions respecting the development and production of nuclear weapons. He's not only a serial violator, he's been a serial deceiver here. Two, that Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Three, Iran is a leading international sponsor of terrorism, not only in the Middle East, but beyond. And finally, as I mentioned, the domestic mass repression. So 60 leading international law scholars, human rights advocates, experts in genocide, leading Iranian Canadians have come together to craft a petition that basically calls on the international community to undertake its legal responsibilities to hold Ahmadinejad's Iran to account. Regrettably, as we speak, for example, not one state party to the International Convention, not Canada, not the United States, not any of the state parties in the European Union, has undertaken its legal responsibilities to hold Ahmadinejad to account for its state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. We have yet to enact the necessary network of sanctions regarding the the violations, with respect to the violations of the prohibitions regarding the production and development of nuclear weapons, and similarly with regard to the violations of human rights. So the international community at this point has not undertaken its responsibilities. This petition is a form of a wake-up call to sound the alarm so that the international community can act before it becomes too late and we find Iran a nuclear power with all the attending violations and threats.
Folks, our guest today, the Right Honourable Irwin Cotler, standing MP for Mount Royal riding in Montreal, the island of Montreal, my old hometown. He's the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and his resume is about my arm's length long, and he can add another one of those achievements to his resume, and that is he's just been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, and I want to congratulate you on that, my friend.
Thank you. I actually was as surprised by that as I'm sure your listeners would be, but I have no control over those who make those nominations. So there it is.
I think it's well deserved. Let's go back. Your petition, the responsibility to prevent petition, and specifically against Ahmadinejad. And folks, if you don't know who that is, Ahmadinejad is, of course, the president of Iran. Why is the international community not behind their legal right to take action against Ahmadinejad's Iran?
Well, I think in part, though, this may sound surprising, I think at times international leaders may not even be aware of their responsibilities to act. I often recall experience I had in April 2004 when I was Minister of Justice at a meeting of G8 Ministers of Justice in Washington. And I recall before the meeting I asked our host at the time, the American Attorney General, if the genocide in Darfur was on the agenda, and he said no, but he said the agenda's already been drawn up in advance, but we are having an informal dinner and you can speak to it. So I did, and at the end of the dinner, 4 of the ministers of justice of the G8 countries came up to me and said they had not even heard about the genocide in Darfur. So political leaders sometimes live in a bubble and may not always be aware of the threats that do exist, of the violations of law and human rights that are extant, and not by even aware of their responsibilities to prevent and combat them. I think that is similarly what is happening with regard to Ahmadinejad, although it's hard to appreciate that people should be unaware. I think the threats are clear, but as yet there's not a sufficient appreciation that any state party to the Genocide Convention, for example, has a responsibility to undertake the remedies mandated by international law to hold Ahmadinejad to account, whether that be initiating an interstate complaint before the International Court of Justice for Iran's violations of the Genocide Convention, and Iran is a state party to that Genocide Convention, yet no state party has done that, or simply the more modest remedy of referring it to the UN Security Council for deliberation and account, or putting Iranian leaders on a watch list and thereby affecting travel bans and the like. Somebody like Ahmadinejad should not be a feted guest at the United Nations. He belongs really in the docket of the accused.
Agreed with you wholeheartedly. I hearken back to the days as when Arafat was invited there and he was hailed as a god. I was going to say goddamn, and I better not. I'll have to edit that part out. But he was hailed as a hero, a conquering hero when he waltzed into the United Nations. Is that the same mindset that's in place right now in the United Nations as well? Is that perhaps why?
Well, the United States, as the host country for the United Nations sittings, believes it is under an obligation to admit whoever is coming to the United Nations under what is called a headquarters agreement, an agreement between the host state and the United Nations, and that there's no precedent to exclude someone. That's not true. When Kurt Waldheim was the head of state in Austria, the United Nations did exclude him at the time for his complicity in war crimes, and clearly there was a juridical basis to have excluded Ahmadinejad from coming to the United Nations. I'm pleased at least that the Secretary General and heads of governments did walk out when he got up to speak, but as I said, this is a person who belongs in the docket of the accused.
You had mentioned the G8 before, and 4 of the members weren't even aware of the genocide taking place in Darfur. Dare I ask who the 4 members were?
Well, I'll tell you, I'd rather not single them out. I'm using it as an example of political leaders who sometimes live in a bubble, and this would be true of myself when I was in government. It's because you get overwhelmed by the sheer daily responsibilities. Something like Darfur seems far away, etc. But I will say to their credit, when they were advised of it, they then sought to act.
Folks, if you're just joining us today, our guest, of course, is the Right Honourable Irwin Cotler. He is the MP, standing MP for Mount Royal riding in Montreal. He is also the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. How great is that? And completely deserving of the award as well, folks. Let's hope he gets it and he is given due recognition. Let's talk some more about terrorism, global terrorism. As we speak, I had just mentioned Ahmadinejad was in New York the day before this recording is taking place, folks. Also this weekend came out that there was a terrorist attack thwarted, thank goodness it was thwarted, by an alert Vietnam veteran in New York City again. Money has to come from somewhere to fund these terrorist attacks. To buy an SUV, they don't grow on trees, and to buy all the chemicals that go into making a bomb, they don't grow on trees either. I'm going to ask you to speculate. Do you think some of that money is coming from Iran?
I don't know about that in terms of the New York incident. I wouldn't want to speculate on that. It doesn't look like it's the kind of work of Iran. They tend to work through very known and public terrorist proxies like Hezbollah on Israel's northern border and Hamas on the southern borders, where they openly train and finance and arm and instigate their terrorist proxies. They were also held to be, and several Iranian leaders were named by the Argentinian judiciary for having planned and, in fact, been complicit in the greatest terrorist atrocity in Argentina since the Second World War, the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, the AMIA. And there is right now, as we speak, an Interpol arrest warrant, international arrest warrant for Ahmed Vahidi, who is the Minister of Defense in Iran, so named this past August, even though he's under an Interpol arrest warrant. And so Iran's tentacles are not only in the immediate neighborhood of Israel in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah, they go beyond into places like Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and then they go across the ocean into Argentina and Latin America and the like. So its tentacles are broad, extensive, and dangerous. But with regard to yesterday's attack in New York, I'm not yet sure, in fact, even doubt that their fingerprints are on that one. It does not look like an Iranian type of initiative.
Okay, fair enough. I want to talk some more. You mentioned Israel. Several weeks ago, Israel Apartheid Week, right here in Canada, on campuses right across the country. You were the Attorney General. How do we balance the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and pure hatred, literature, and lies that are spewed forth during this particular week, not only against Israel, but by extension, Jewish Canadians as well, and Jews around the world? How do we balance those two?
Well, I think we have to appreciate in the case of Israel Apartheid Week, where it crosses the line is not where it may accuse Israel of any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. I mean, Israel, like any other state, is accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. But that's the point. Like any other state, where you have a singling out of Israel for differential and discriminatory treatment in the international arena, or, and this is where I believe it crosses the line, where within Israel Apartheid Week there is a call for the dismantling of Israel as a Jewish state on the grounds that apartheid is a crime against humanity and Israel is an apartheid state constitutes a crime against humanity, and thereby student supporters are themselves collaborative criminals, where that crosses the line not only into the demonization of Israel, but into the effective intimidation and stereotyping and silencing of its supporters, then I think that's outside the bounds of academic freedom. In fact, to the extent that we talk about free speech, or outside the bounds of freedom of speech, because the free speech issue then becomes a silencing of Jewish students and other supporters of a state that one calls for its dismantling. And in fact, when it's also referred to as a Nazi state, it's even held out as a kind of imperative that one is obliged to dismantle. I think at that point, one gets into a situation where just as we would not allow on campuses, in my view, a week devoted to gay bashing or a week devoted to women bashing or black bashing, I think similarly we shouldn't have a week devoted to Israel bashing. Again, I want to say legitimate criticism of Israel, and indeed rigorous criticism of Israel, should be protected speech. It does belong on the campuses. But when it crosses the line to do away with Israel, then I think that kind of activity activity, there has to be some kind of accountability.
Folks, our guest today, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and let me repeat that once again, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, fellow Canadian, the Right Honorable Irwin Cotler, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General. I want to clarify for all the students that are listening right now, this show is broadcast from coast to coast to coast throughout Canada through the University Network. I want to bust down the myth. I would like you to explain very clearly how Israel is not an apartheid state.
Let me just say, as somebody who was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, in fact, who was arrested at one point for my involvement in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa at the time, I think to make that kind of comparison is really, apart from being prejudicial to Israel, is demeaning to the real struggle against the real apartheid. Those of us who knew and experienced the real apartheid can only regard that kind of analogy as being insulting. If you look at South Africa as an apartheid state, it did not have universal franchise as Israel does. It did not have an opportunity to elect blacks to parliament in the same way that you have 10% of the Israeli parliament composed of Israeli Arabs or Muslims. I can go down the line. You don't have anything equivalent to the race laws, the institutionalized race laws in South Africa of a Nuremberg-like character. So, as I said at one point to the then Foreign Minister of South Africa upon my arrest in 1981, I said, South Africa is the only post-Nazi state. I said, I don't like to make any comparison to Naziism, but the only post-Nazi state that has institutionalized racism as a matter of law, that apartheid is not only a racist philosophy, it's a legalized racist regime. That is utterly the difference between, South Africa and Israel, with its universal franchise, free press, independent judiciary, and the like.
This is a perfect segue. Folks, our guest today has been called Mr. Human Rights, and justifiably so. Our guest today, the Right Honorable Irwin Cotler, of course, and he crisscrosses the globe, always defending human rights. And one of those people you have defended and advised and counseled is none other than Nelson Mandela.
My work there was of a very modest character. It grew out of post-arrest experience that I had in South Africa. In fact, I was arrested because I gave a speech in South Africa at the time, which was called "If Sharansky, Why Not Mandela?" Sharansky was then a political prisoner in the former Soviet Union. Mandela was then a prisoner in Robben Island, and he was, in effect, a banned person. You could not mention his name, and if you did, it would subject you to the kind of sanction that I experienced when I gave a speech, and now I'm mentioning his name, but in fact, in the title of the speech, it said, Sharansky, why not Mandela? Namely, why should he also not be freed? And just to encapsulate very quickly, I then was asked would I act as Canadian counsel with respect to Mandela in order to help make case and cause for Mandela outside South Africa, while of course those who bore the burden and made the case, some of whom I met with just recently when I was in South Africa, like George Bezos and the like, were the real attorneys of record to whom his freedom is ultimately to be owed. I will say that when I was in South Africa last September, I had an opportunity to link up with some of the people that I had worked in the anti-apartheid movement, like George Bezos, and with Nelson Mandela's first wife, Winnie Mandela, who was also a very important voice for Nelson Mandela while he was imprisoned. It just confirmed to me something else that I've learned, and having been representing political prisoners in different parts of the world, whether it was Sharansky or whether it was Saad ad-Din Ibrahim in Egypt or Mandela. However, as I say, modest my role in these matters. In each instance, what I found or was able to determine was that each of these people were ultimately freed very much due to the work of their wife, who was on the outside and became their voice and their advocate. That's an important thing to bear in mind, the important role that is played very often by the spouse or by the family, who endure a great deal while their husband or father, mother, wife is in prison, who help make their liberation possible.
Our guest today, the Right Honorable Irwin Cotler. I want to bring it down to a micro level right now, right here in Canada. You were the former Attorney General. Where does Canada fall short for human rights?
Yeah, I think I would say that one area and one continent in which Canada falls short is the African continent. If there is one place in the world today that has been abandoned very much by the international community, and I include Canada in it, and I'm not making this as a partisan statement, the government of which I was a member could have done more, in my view as well, with regard to the genocide by attrition in Darfur at the time. And now, as we speak, you have a situation in the Congo which is horrific. I mean, this has been called the rape capital of the world, but it is not only the number of women that are being raped, and that too doesn't even bring home, the horrific mutilation and massive sexual violence that has taken place, but the impunity with which this continues to take place, or the fact that the Congo is really the place of what has been referred to as Africa's Third World War, which is unfortunately not even on the radar screen, that between 1998 and 2007, as the International Rescue Organization itself demonstrated, some 5.4 million people in the Congo died, and yet, as we speak, we have some 45,000 dying every month, and others in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. So this cries out really for intervention, cries out for Canadian leadership. And I regret to say, in the last two speeches from the throne, the word Africa was not even mentioned, let alone the word Congo. I can go on with respect to other places in Africa. I think in Sudan, we have to guard against the fact that Sudan can unravel very quickly. While Darfur may not be on the radar screen, and the nature and extent of the killings has certainly abated and lessened in Darfur, yet the upcoming referendum next year for independence for southern Sudan, the kind of corruption that attended the elections that just took place now in Sudan, suggests that unless we involve ourselves, both the comprehensive peace agreement that ended the North-South war in which 2 million died in Sudan, and also the Darfur peace agreement may both unravel and in fact involve neighboring countries. It's said that if Sudan begins to implode, some 9 regional and neighboring African countries will be prejudicially affected. So I think, to sum that up, we need to make Africa a priority in our foreign policy, and I gave just 2 examples. I think it's also true of international women's rights. I mentioned the Congo, but the trafficking in women has become really a contemporary slave trade, and that the most dramatically increasing criminal industry in the world. We need to take a strong stand with respect to not only combating trafficking of women in enacting laws, and I know the governor of which I was a part criminalized trafficking in women, but we need to protect the victims of trafficking, and I think on that there's a need to do more. So I just named 2 areas, as I say, Africa in its comprehensive sense, international women's rights as another example, but I do think that we have a role to play even in the matter of Ahmadinejad's Iran. As I mentioned earlier, there's certain express and specific initiatives and remedies that we can adopt, and if not yet have been doing so, combating also the culture of impunity, where we have Ahmed Vahidi, the Minister of Defense in Iran, and even President Bashir of Sudan, both of them the objects of criminal indictments and arrest warrants, and yet both of them continuing without any accountability. So we need as well to hold the perpetrators to account, lest we encourage others to in fact commit similar crimes.
Folks, our guest today, the Right Honourable Irwin Cotler. He's the former Minister of Justice, of course, and Attorney General of Canada. He's a professor of law on leave from McGill University in Montreal, where he is an MP for the Mount Royal riding on the island. Have a tough question for you now. Bill 101. I'm an ex-Montrealer. How do you feel about Bill 101? Do you think it goes against the Canadian Charter of Freedoms and Rights?
I think the attempts of late to, in fact, enlarge upon Bill 101 and give it a more restrictive application have, in fact, been held by the Supreme Court to be overreaching and breaching Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and therefore it gave the Quebec government a year to bring its language laws in line with the prescriptive framework of the Supreme Court decision respecting, in particular, language in education. And I would hope, that in fact the Quebec government would comply with it. At the time, I was one of those who was a critic of Bill 101. It then became a law. Then were Supreme Court decisions which struck down those parts which were deemed to be breaches of the Charter, and I think we have a situation at this point whereby it is important that the most recent decision of the Supreme Court in that regard be complied with by the Quebec government.
Thank you for your honesty. Folks, of course, our guest today is the Right Honourable Irwin Cotler. I should tell you also, www.brenthollandshow.com. I'm going to put Mr. Cotler's link there, and with his permission, which I will ask him right now, a link so you can download his The Responsibility to Prevent petition. Is that okay with you? I put a link
for
it?
That's fine.
Great. Mr. Cotler, you're virtually speaking to every Canadian university student from coast to coast to coast through the university system, as well as international students. What would you say to them?
Well, I think that the young people come with a certain moral authority by virtue of the fact that they are young and have not yet been implicated in those things that could be attributed to any form of corruption or accountability. I think that therefore they can speak with a certain moral authority. The young people are really not only the legatees of the past, but the trustees of our future. And so I would just say to them to always remember, if I can borrow the words of a sage, Maimonides, he said, to see the world as being divided into half evil and half good, and therefore one good deed by any one of us can transform the ledger in favor of the good. So every day we each have an opportunity to do that one good deed and have, if I can say, a cosmic impact. And I look to the young people to make the world a better place and to make it a better place in that which we have been bequeathing to them.
That's beautiful. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon and taking the time out of your busy schedule and doing all your work that you've done for human rights right around the globe and right here at home. Sei gesund, my friend.
Thank you, and good speaking with you.
Thank you. I sincerely want to thank the Honourable Irwin Cotler for coming on the show this afternoon. It was indeed an honor for me to have a man of this stature and a fellow Canadian Nobel Peace Prize nominee. I can't say that enough. It sounds fantastic, and I can't think of anybody more deserving. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'm Brent Holland. See you next time.